So, Deborah, there are a lot of terms that you use in your work that seem to come up over and over again. But I also know that professionals and parents and teachers are constantly inundated with new ideas and new terms. What makes a concept lasting? What is the kind of the hallmark of an idea that you should pay attention to as opposed to something that might be a fad?
I think what makes something long lasting is when it applies in different situations, in different contexts. So, attachment, for example, is a term that Bowlby introduced in the 60s. And what we've learned in research over that period of time is that attachment processes, caring, nurturing relationships, are important in infancy when he was looking at it, through development, adolescence, into adulthood. And it's the nature of relationships that is enduring, not just in England where he was, but in other cultures as well. So it has something to do with the generalizability of it, that it fits people's understanding of the world and helps them think about it in a bit more organized way.
You mentioned the term attachment. Can you define that?
It was again Bowlby's term that refers to the relationship initially conceived between an infant and the infant's primary caregiver, mother, father, or other caregiver. And it's a relationship in which the infant feels secure, knows that that adult will respond in an appropriate way and help them deal with the distress that they're experiencing. And the thing about an attachment relationship is when a child gets distressed, they can come back to that caring adult. But also by having a secure base, children can move out into the world with confidence and do a bit more risk-taking and a bit more exploring because they can come back to that adult who is going to be there and reliably responsive to them.
It is one of the kind of maybe seeming contradictions of attachment, that the stronger the bond between the primary caregiver and the child, the more able the child is to move away from them, right?
Isn't that interesting? What we understand is the child develops a model of the world, a model of relationships in the world. And a child who's securely attached, who has a nurturing relationship, thinks that the world is a pretty predictable place where they can go out and explore and be safe. Whereas a child who has an insecure attachment will either avoid people because people aren't safe, or avoid new situations because they haven't that adult to regulate them if they get dysregulated. And there's a group of children who are called as having a disorganized attachment. And that's children who unfortunately grow up in relationships where the adult can at one moment be safe and caring, and at then another moment be quite frightening. So that child just lives in sort of a bit of a chaos of relationships. And so it is the case that children who have a secure attachment have what's called an internal working model, an understanding of relationships that are predictable and secure and nurturant and caring and safe above all.
And it starts, if I'm not mistaken, with the child's belief that their needs will get met. Because when they reach out to that primary care provider, that it is that, and they're hungry or they're scared, or that they just need to be comforted in some way, that the adult responds appropriately to that. Is that correct?
That's right. And sometimes, as you may well know, it's really hard to figure out what a child, especially an infant, needs. When they're crying, you don't know whether they're hungry or they're tired or they need changing. And so the adult has to sort of be calm themselves,
Right.
and try different strategies to meet the child's needs and to calm the child. And For some parents, that's really hard because they themselves are stressed. They themselves have needs that aren't met. And so it's really difficult for them to be present and 100% responsive to the child when they're struggling themselves. So this isn't always easy, is what I mean to say.
But I think I mean, you and I have talked about this in a different context, but I think that there's a power in just responding when you know that newborn is in distress, right?
Absolutely. And every parent wants to be responsive and caring. And yes, the child is excellent at communicating their
Right.
distress, just excellent. And we as adults are wired to respond because it's really an aversive sound. So it is the case that, adults do their best to figure that out, and it's reassuring for the child. But it's a new understanding, and we'll talk about it probably about co-regulation, that the child's dysregulated when they're in distress, and even if the adult can pick them up and help them regulate and rock them and soothe them, that's reassuring for the child.
Well, since you brought it up, you brought up regulation. So again, this is a term that is in your work over and over again. What is regulation?
Regulation is really a neural process. It's in the brain, and it's the ability to control your emotions and control your behavior. And I think a lot about regulation because much of my work has been on children's aggressive behavior problems. And children who exhibit these problems are quite dysregulated. They get annoyed and they act out, or they hurt someone, or they create distress in a classroom, and they're dysregulated. So one of the primary strategies for helping aggressive children is to help them self-regulate, help them slow down, help them put their hands in their pockets so they don't hit people, and take some deep breaths to calm their brain and be able to use the thought processes that are available to them, but not so accessible if they're highly aroused.
I mean, you've written, and I want to quote this here, you've written that emotion and behavioral regulation is the cornerstone of healthy development.
Well, I think it is the cornerstone of healthy development because if we think about the tasks that are required of infants, of toddlers, of preschoolers, of school-age children, of adolescents, all of those tasks require regulation. They require regulation to interact with others. So when you're learning to turn take, you have to be patient and take your turn. When you're learning to sit in a circle and listen to a story, you have to sit quietly and not bump into your neighbors. When you're required to sit at a desk in school and focus on work and memorize some information or figure out a mathematical problem, all of those require attention. And in order to attend, you need to be regulated, first off.
And when you describe it like that, it seems to make very obvious the idea that you're interacting in a context, that there's other people that are required for that interaction, for the success in school, that you have to accommodate others and not just your most immediate impulse.
That's right. I think that's where regulation really comes in, is that all of us grow up in a social context, whether it's in the family or the school or the peer group, or a workplace or an intimate relationship. We're always required to act reciprocally and act responsively to the others whom we're with. And so our behavior impacts them and their behavior impacts us. So both parties actually need to work on regulation.
Well, you've used the term already. You've used this term healthy relationships. And that's such a loaded term. You've defined healthy relationships in some of your writings. And again, I kind of want to quote this. You've said healthy relationships are those that help us feel valued and safe, support us to function and learn a wide range of skills, do not add stress to our lives, but help us to buffer the stresses we encounter. Let's talk about those independently. Obviously, an attachment, which we've already defined, has a lot to do with helping us feel valued and safe. So that's a hallmark of a healthy relationship right there.
It is, absolutely. I think probably the foundational piece of it is safety. And we just talked about attachment, and if a child doesn't feel safe, they can come back to the secure base. A relationship has to be safe in order to be predictable. And I think trust is the counterpart to that, that when someone's safe and someone's predictable and someone's available reliably to you, you do feel safe and you do start to trust. And if the counterpart to that is if you don't trust and you haven't trusted, then there are really significant problems as you move through life, because you're looking around the corner at every person, at every situation, with fear and anxiety about what's going to unfold. And I've had the opportunity to work in a setting where women are involved with their young children, and most often these women don't trust because nobody's been trustworthy in their lives. So it's really foundational.
Well, and I don't mean to state the obvious, and I don't mean to be repetitive because you've said this, but it seems so profound. It's worth just saying it again. So those early relationships that we have, if we can trust in them and feel safe in them, that impacts how we view the rest of the world.
It does, and it really lays a pathway for how an infant develops in the context of relationships across the lifespan. So if you see relationships as something that's reliable, that's predictable, where you feel comfortable and happy and safe, then that's how you approach the world, and it's how you approach, the other classmates in your preschool class, or at school or in high school, how you start to think about romantic relationships. And it's not that can't change, because you can change your attachment status, it's called, but it tends to be quite difficult, and that model of relationships goes with you throughout the lifespan if you don't have experiences that challenge it and show you what safety and trust looks like in a relationship.
And so that second part of your definition really does flow from that very first feeling safe and feeling valued, that idea that the healthy relationships support us to function and learn a wide range of skills. So without that foundation, we're afraid all the time. We're not exploring.
Yeah.
That's scary.
It's really scary. And you can think about that. So think about a child who comes into school after having had a really difficult evening and perhaps a night of parents fighting and listening to that and having a hard time getting to sleep. And the child walks through the door of the school and they're so activated, they're so aroused, they're so uncomfortable in their body and their mind that they're just not ready to learn. And I think the other thing I've thought about is that those guidelines and support sometimes require adults to be quite directive. So teachers are quite directive, parents are quite directive in saying, no, you can't do that. You can do these things, but that's not on. And if a child feels valued and that the parents care for them or the teacher cares for them, then they'll go, oh, I guess they know, I guess they know. But if a child thinks that the adult doesn't understand them and doesn't appreciate who they are and what they're dealing with and how much they're carrying, then they're going to go, well, they just don't understand me. Why would I ever work hard and, try to master this task that's in front of me?
Or, why would I even think that an adult could help me in a way if they hadn't experienced that, right?
Yes, yes.
So the other part, the third part of your definition of healthy relationship is they don't add stress to our lives, these healthy relationships.
I think we're learning so much about stress and how, particularly stress in relationships, is so detrimental to well-being in its broadest sense. And I think that's why the word healthy relationships is an important one, because it has to do with health. It has to do with physical health and mental health, social and emotional well-being. And what we know is that children who grow up in these caring, nurturing relationships are healthy. And even if things happen, such as victimization, being bullied by peers, those children can go home and feel safe and feel supported by parents who say, "Oh, that sounds so difficult for you. What did you try? And, what else could you try? And maybe this has come to the point where we need to go together and talk to somebody about this." And so there's a sense that even if they're stressors, the bumps in the road are sort of smooth because they're these really caring adults walking beside you.
Well, and that's what's so worrisome about this, because again, the fourth part of your definition that you just alluded to here, which is to help buffer the stressors that we encounter. But in your research, you've also discovered that people who don't have those supportive relationships at home in their earliest years, they might not recognize an unhealthy relationship later in their life. So it's not just that they've been robbed of a place that they can go to deal with the stressors of an unhealthy relationship. They might not recognize an unhealthy relationship. Tell me about some of that research.
No, it's so interesting, and it goes back to that working model, or the understanding that children develop about relationships and what they should look like. And I've had the opportunity to work with Breaking the Cycle, a program for substance using mothers and their young children, and we've disseminated their program for interpersonal violence. And what's so interesting when you talk to the women who've been through the program is they go, like, I didn't know that I was being abused.
Mm-hmm.
I'd seen my mother being treated that way. I didn't know men shouldn't hit their partners. And it's because they didn't have a model of relationships, of attachment relationships early, and other relationships that said, you're worthy, you're of value, and you need to be safe. You need to be safe. And if you're not safe in relationships, that relationship's not healthy. And when women come to understand this, they can then think about their relationships with their own children and how important it is for them to create these safe and healthy relationships for their children. And it's really a turning point for some of the women who go through this program.
And it's not just, I mean, you're talking about intimate partner violence, which you've studied, but this also factors into bullying. If you don't recognize a coercive relationship, or you don't recognize that as unhealthy, you seem to be more likely to be involved in bullying too, according to your research.
That's right. You're involved in both bullying others and in being victimized. It's really complex because bullying unfolds in the context of a peer group. And when you look at school-age children, there's very little that's more important in their lives than to be accepted by their peers and to be part of a peer group. And we have videotapes of children on the playground and can see that children cycle back into a relationship with a child who's being aggressive with them because it feels better to be in that relationship and at least being seen and connected than to be isolated and left alone and, completely ignored during school break time.
Is it that it feels familiar, or is it really just an unhealthy relationship is better than no relationship? Or is it both?
I think it might be both.
Yeah.
I think it might be both. Some of the children who are victimized have strained relationships at home. Many of them are at the periphery of the social group, so they don't have other friends to connect to. And they find whatever means it takes to feel connected, because that's such an important human need.
You've already mentioned why you use the term healthy relationships, but again, I want to go back to it because I want to emphasize it a little bit, because you could have chosen other terms. We've seen people use terms like positive relationships, but you like healthy because of its literal definition. What do healthy relationships, what do they predict?
They predict positive life outcomes, but it's sometimes easier to see what unhealthy relationships predict, if we can. For example, it goes down to the cellular level. So there's some research out of England that looks at children at 5 and looks at their DNA at 5 and 10 and compares at age 10 the telomere length, and I'll just go back to that, of the children who've experienced at least 2 types of interpersonal trauma. They've 2 out of 3. So they've either been maltreated themselves, they've witnessed interparental violence, or they've been badly victimized by their peers. If they've experienced 2 of those, they're compared to children who didn't experience any.
Okay.
And what they find is that the telomeres, which is like a cap at the end of a DNA, has already started to shrink. And that's a process associated with aging. So as we age, our telomere length decreases. And what this says to me is between the ages of 5 and 10, children who've experienced these types of interpersonal stress, which really it is stress, have this toll down at the cellular level in their bodies. So it's truly unhealthy. It's truly unhealthy. There are other studies too that look at neural development, and it of course goes when children live in stress-free contexts, their neural development is well underway. Some children, of course, have neural difficulties, but it can be optimized in a positive environment where the child is learning to regulate, and we go back to that concept of regulation. And when you're regulated, you can engage with the world in a better way. So you can take care of yourself, you can take care of others, others can take care of you in a better way. So it just sets up what I see as foundational to health and well-being.
So the dark interpretation of where we are in our discussion so far is that if you had a bad model of a relationship in your earliest, most formative years, that you're on a pretty dark path, a path that is unhealthy, that is aging you quicker. But you also write about that there are relationship skills. There are things that people can learn to do and bring to relationships. So what are some of the skills that humans need in addition to regulation? What are some of the skills that humans need in order to obtain and maintain these healthy relationships?
I think perspective taking is one of those skills. So it's not only about standing where you are and understanding yourself, so self-reflection, but also being able to understand the other. And empathy is sort of a notch up above that, because it's not just being able to understand the other, but it's feeling for the other and for how the other feels. And that's essential for positive interactions in relationships. The other skills that I think you need, I mentioned self-reflection. I think you need to understand yourself quite well. You need to recognize when there's situations that are really difficult for you and either distance yourself from them if possible, or manage them in ways that constrain or dampen the impact of it on you. Communication is another skill, of course, that you need in relationships, the ability to talk and understand the other. And what comes with that is conflict resolution and being able to cope with times when you're in conflict. We're always in conflict in close relationships, and being able to talk that through and work it through. And I was thinking that there's the other aspect of it is just knowing how to deal with stress, because stress comes along regularly in our days and weeks and months. And when it comes along, being able to recognize it and deal with it effectively if you can, and try to distance yourself from it if it's something that's something you can't change.
You said self-reflection, but in some of your writings, there's like a scarier term that you use, or a more intimidating term, this idea of metacognition,
Okay.
which, if I understand that correctly, means thinking about thinking. Is it true that people don't spend a lot of time thinking about how they think?
My sense is that there's more of that. There's more thinking about thinking now, because there have been big changes in meditation and mindfulness, at
Right.
least in Western societies. And so there's a sense that we need to be aware of our thinking processes. And the more aware we are, the more we can understand and control, I guess is the right word, so that we can take some deep breaths and think about what's happening in our mind and say, oh, that's what's going on. So now I need not to let myself spin around this issue and get myself all upset about it. I just need to take time, come back to it later because I'm not in a good place to deal with it now, or talk to somebody about it because it's beyond my control. So that's the kind of thinking about thinking that helps us navigate, and particularly navigate relationships. Right. If we think about what's the most difficult thing we do in a day, my sense is that it's navigating relationships. Right. It's not adding up the numbers on your bank account, or writing the shopping list, or whatever it is we do in a day. It's getting along with others.
It's interesting that when you were talking about thinking, you went right away to meditation, because at least my understanding of mindfulness and meditation, which again, it's not a religion,
Yeah.
right? It is thinking about thinking. But the other part of it, if I'm not mistaken, is also being aware not only of your brain as an organ, but of how your body is, what's happening to the rest of your body, right? And that is really important for stress.
It's so important. My brother works in that area and calls it sort of radical wholeness, that the body and the mind aren't separate. Right. Even if the pictures we see are of a little circle on top of a female or a male body to tell us which washroom to go in, they're very integral. And our body actually senses earlier than our mind when we're in a stress situation or a dangerous situation. We get the butterflies in our stomach, or a feeling in our gut that precedes any kind of rational thought about things. So I do think we need to be much more attentive to our body's messages. And that's something that is done with aggressive children, in helping them slow down and think about things. There are hot topics or hot hot buttons that get pushed on them. And if you can help children figure out what it feels like when somebody pushes that hot button, well, I feel hot and I get myself tensed and my teeth clench, it really gives awareness to what's coming next, and how to counteract that before you get yourself into trouble because you've punched somebody in response. So I think it very much works together, and we talk about mind, body, but they're essentially one thing.
Well, and to go back to the very beginning of our discussion, talking about attachment, when you've interviewed and observed these aggressive kids, you've learned that they're actually operating out of a place of fear.
Lots out of a place of fear.
Which is so odd, because if you're a teacher or a parent, or just somebody working with kids, these aggressive children can be frightening to you. So to understand that they themselves are afraid is kind of radical.
Yes, and even if you asked them if they were afraid, they'd probably say no.
Right.
Because they don't have much awareness of that. But, they brainstem, the very sort of most primitive parts of our brain are wired to, fight or flee or freeze. They're just these absolute basic processes that enable us to survive in really difficult situations. And these children are highly aroused that way. They're just always on the ready to because of the lack of regulation, they're just ready to snap quite quickly. So it's surprising to an outside observer that a child who's just so out of control and it's so difficult is really a child who's struggling with lack of safety, of trust in the adults, not feeling valued by the adults or other children in a classroom, and so it just doesn't sit well, and they are on high alert.
This is a video on defining terms that get used a lot in your research and in your writing. I only mention that because I want to talk a little bit about ACEs in the context of things that undermine healthy relationships. And I know you've talked about some of these things independent of the term ACEs, but tell me a little bit about what ACEs are and why they're important, you think.
ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and there was research done in the US with adults, asking them about 8 or 10 different adverse experiences that they had as children. And the thing about experiences of children is that you don't have much control over them. You can't change them. They're happening in your house. And they were things like a parent who is addicted or uses substances, a parent who's been incarcerated, family violence, maltreatment, a parent with mental health problems, those types of things. And when you step back and think about what those are, they're all situations where the relationship between the child and the adult in that child's life would not be secure and warm and positive and healthy. And so looking at these individuals as they rated the ACEs scores that they had, what they found was if an adult had 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, they were much more likely to have every chronic disease that you could talk about. They were much more likely to use substances or smoke, or have heart disease or lung disease or cancer. It didn't matter what disease you looked at, they were more likely to have it, which takes us back to why the word healthy in relationships is so important. Because if you grew up with 4 or more ACEs, it was really unhealthy for you in terms of what was being laid down, the type of stress that the child was experiencing, the lack of predictability, the lack of security and safety, and their consequences across the lifespan if that hasn't changed, which is not to say you can't change. And, we talked about a little bit about that. I'm often asked, what point is it too late?
Right.
At what point is it too late to change? And I think the answer to that question is probably never. That we can always help another come to understand the past, come to understand the trauma in their past, come to understand that they weren't responsible for it. We as children aren't responsible for the trauma that lives around us and in relationships around us, and begin to trust. And it's been interesting working at breaking the cycle, because these women, it takes quite a while, but they come to see that relationships aren't all untrustworthy, that you can trust. And if somebody says they'll be there and they'll meet you at a certain place, they'll be there, or that they'll find something for you, they'll find it. And these are not the type of relationships that these women have experienced.
When I think about ACEs, something that helps me contextualize them is the notion that, or not the notion, but the fact that these are all things that happen to a child. And I bring that up because too often we see a child that has trouble regulating, has trouble controlling impulses, has trouble with anger, and we blame it on a weakness in the child. Some people call it a defect in character, even in some programs, right?
Yeah.
But it might result from something that has happened to the child. And resilience, the counterbalance to those ACEs and adversity, is also something that happens to us, right, through these relationships, right? So it's not their fault. And the other reason I wanted to mention that is because of this other thing that is, I find a little frightening in your work, but I recognize it from my own experiences, and that is the bidirectionality of relationships, those feedback loops. Can you kind of define what you're talking about when you're talking about bidirectionality, in particular between a relationship between a child and a parent, or a child and a teacher?
Well, it's really interesting, and the best way to look at it is over time, longitudinally. And you can see, if you have data repeatedly over time within a given year, over years, that a child who is disruptive and causes a lot of problems, the level of disruptive behavior in the child will predict, for example, how ineffective a mother's responses to that child is. And the more ineffective a mother's responses are to the child, the more the child will act out in a subsequent observation. So that's the bidirectionality over time. But there's also bidirectionality or reciprocity within time. So, you can imagine a parent comes in and says to a child, "Oh, look at it, it's 7 o'clock. It's time it's time to start to get ready to bed." And the kid said, "Oh, I'm watching TV." And the mother goes off and washes dishes and comes back and said, "Oh my gosh, it's 7:40. What have you been doing? I told you to go." And the child goes, "No, I want to watch this program." And the mother goes off and then does a couple of other things, comes back. "It's 8:10 now." And the child just, explodes and wants to finish the next program. And the whole thing, accelerates, until finally the mother throws up her hands and says, "That's it. Stay up all night. You'll feel sick tomorrow." But, it's like they ramp each other up through a bidirectional process where, and I'm a parent of 3 children. I've been caught in these bidirectional processes for sure. And what it really requires of us is to regulate. And, I'm back at that word again, but the more we can regulate, the more the child can regulate. And we're models. What we don't know, or what I think we're often not aware of, is as parents or as a teacher, we're like on stage for kids. They are so attuned to us. Their brains are so attuned to us. They watch every single thing we
Yeah.
do, and they model it, and they mimic it, and they use our words, and they use the kind of behavior we do. So, it's really important that we as the adults don't get caught up in what Jerry Patterson called coercive processes.
Well, and part of that too, I think is, and the reason I wanted to mention it is, I think if we're aware of it, then we can, as adults in the lives of kids, then hopefully we can exercise some metacognition and address how we're thinking. Because if there's such a rich literature about what you believe about a child will actually predict how that child acts in some very interesting ways. So if you're already upset with how the child is acting, and you're, as you pointed out, less likely to have a good outcome. But if you can recognize that that's why you're upset, maybe you can undo it, or at least I hope that's part of what we can accomplish with this, right?
I think you're right. And it goes back to the discussion of infancy. Here's this child screaming its head off, and you're at the end of your rope, and you can't figure out, necessarily what it is. It's really important to sort of take a deep breath and just, understand that you're doing your best, and that, picking up the child and trying to calm them down, using a calm voice, not screaming, which you feel like doing.
Right.
Just being present in the moment with that child is really important. And, the child isn't screaming to get you mad. The child is screaming as a form of communication because something's wrong. And you take that up to, the terrible twos, or the, 3-year-olds that have tantrums and are just so difficult to deal with. And it's really important for us as adults, as you said, to just stop and think for a minute. Like, what's happening here for the child? What's the child experiencing? And what can I do to calm the child in this moment? Because I'm not going to solve the problem in the moment. They've lost their favorite ball, or something went terribly wrong. I can't solve that problem when the child is that activated, because no part of their, what's called executive functioning part of their brain, the thinking, sort of logical thinking part of the brain, is going to be able to operate under that kind of arousal. So calming the child down is the number one goal at that point. And the only way you can do that is to stay calm yourself.
Yeah.
So, that's the issue. And I think when you're calm yourself, you can take a few minutes to do that perspective taking that I was talking about. Like, what's happening for this child? And maybe I need, as the teacher, to just take a couple of minutes at recess and, sit with him or her, in that quiet spot at the back of the class, and just ask how things are at home and what went on. And, how are things with friends at school? And is it the case that bullying's going on and the child is just highly aroused and just out of control? Or have they come from a really difficult evening at home? And it puts the child's behavior into perspective and shifts the thinking, oh, this is a really bad child, to this is a child who has really bad problems. And
Doesn't it also, in that same way, if you understand the ACEs literature, if you understand trauma sensitivity and that kind of arousal, if you understand dysregulation, then you have to conclude, and we know this from really good research too, is that it feels horrible to the child when they're acting like that, which again, going back to the angry child seeming dangerous to you, but feeling unsafe himself or herself. The idea that this child that might be making you feel horrible in your role as a parent or in your role as a professional or a teacher, that it feels, how they're behaving in that moment feels horrible to them.
Because everything, that whole arousal system is on high alert.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting to be on high alert like that. And our bodies aren't designed to be on high alert for a long time, but these children are often on high alert for a long time. And what they need from a caring adult is for that adult not also to switch to high alert.
Right.
And so this is where co-regulation comes in,
Right.
that we now understand and didn't talk about when I was raising my
Yeah.
children. But the notion that in order to regulate a child, you have to regulate yourself, and you have to calm down. And now that we understand about mirror neurons, which are the neurons in our brains that make us feel the way a person is feeling who's across from us, we understand that you really need to override that. And so if a child is feeling highly aroused, you're going to feel highly aroused. And as the adult, you have to work through that and say, okay, I'm going to stay calm, because if I stay calm, it's going to help the child stay calm, come down from this high alert situation.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that, and we've talked about this in different contexts, that I think that we are only starting to learn about all of the information that is communicated between individuals in a situation like this, or in that situation. And I have to believe, and this isn't being metaphysical, I believe that there is a physical explanation, that if you change your thought about the child, and you can bring in that compassion for how they're feeling in that moment, it will be communicated to the child somehow that you're not looking at them as a problem, that you don't wish them harm, and that will result in better outcomes.
Yeah. And so what is it? Like,
Yeah.
what happens in that moment as an adult is calming down and thinking about that child and taking into account the stress that child's been through? Their body probably changes.
Yeah.
Like their body language changes. They'll drop their shoulders. They won't be on high alert.
Yeah.
They won't be tense. Their face will be relaxed, and their eyes will show caring rather than being, closed and glaring. And of course the child will see that, because at that moment there's nobody more important in that child's space.
Well, and perhaps especially that child.
That's right.
Because because a child like that is so attuned to danger.
Yes.
They're so attuned to it, they see danger where it doesn't exist. So if you're having dangerous thoughts, they're likely to pick up on them,
Yes.
I would suggest.
Yes. I think so too.
There's a couple other terms, and then we're going to come back to the big term that is kind of summarized in all these other ones that appear in your writing. But I want to mention scaffolding, because explain what scaffolding is.
It's a term that was introduced by Jerome Bruner around children's cognitive development, their ability to do, the type of work they do at school: math, reading, science, learning. And a scaffold is a beautiful metaphor, because you put in support that enables the child to work a little bit above the level that they would be able to work at themselves.
Yeah.
So that, it's like getting on a step stool, and you can reach a little bit higher. And then when they get to that point and master skills at that level, then you do it a little bit more. And so the programs in school that we can think of, like the reading programs where they have, the green level and the red level and the blue level, that's all scaffolding. You give children a little, some supports at this level, they get better, and then they can move to this level, can move to this level. We do the same for math. And if they don't do so well, we back them up so they get the concepts here. I use it in terms of social and emotional development, and which I think is much harder to learn than learning how to read and write, because learning how to read and write and do math is a one-to-one correspondence. It's always the same, whether you're reading at home or reading at the library or reading at school. The words are consistent, as are the numbers consistent. Relationships are so inconsistent. The way you interact with your parents is different than the way you interact with your grandparents or an unfamiliar adult. Very different than the way you interact with your siblings or your best friend or an unfamiliar peer. And so there's such finesse required in terms of how to interact with others. And yet, when a child has behavior problems in a classroom and gets into a fight or an argument with another child, we see that as a behavior problem, and we put the child in the corner or at the back of the class. Whereas that child is struggling to figure out how to get along with others and solve problems with others. And we need to put in social scaffolding, social or
Right.
relational scaffolding to say, okay, where is that child at in terms of his or her social capacity? And where do we need to provide supports? And it might be in the moment coaching, it might be supports after school, it might be a children's mental health program. Where do we need to put in supports to enable that child to function a little bit better than they would without the supports?
Well, and I think the beauty of the physicality of the word scaffolding, and when it was taught to me, and I would like to give the shout out to the professor, but I actually don't remember. I remember it was a male teacher said, think about the futility of trying to build the third floor if you haven't built the first and second. And so the other piece that I really want people to understand about scaffolding is you can't expect somebody to develop a higher level skill until they've practiced and developed some that build up to that.
Yes.
Right? So all this to say, you wrap all of this up in what you call your developmental relational approach. We've talked about all of the building blocks, I think, of it. What else would you like to say about the developmental relational approach?
Well, this is a way we've been thinking about children for a long time, that they develop in the context of relationships, and they develop optimally when they're in healthy relationships, and their development is really curtailed or hampered by unhealthy relationships. And so Bronfenbrenner talked about the ecological model, that the child was embedded in the family and the peer group in the school and the community and the broader society. What that did for developmental psychology, or those of us who study children's development, is said, stop just looking at the child, because that's not going to tell you enough. It's not going to tell you enough. You need to look at that child in the relationships in which they're growing up. And it's interesting because culture, even though it seems way out there, is a really important variable, because the norms that the culture ascribes to are then passed down through relationships to the child. And I see that. I do some work with Indigenous communities, and I can see how they work hard to help the children understand these really important cultural values and principles. When I talk about developmental relational, I'm not up in the strong theoretical frame where Rich Lerner has been, and Will Overton and others. I really come down to think about it in the moment. So when you're in the moment with a child, it's really important to think about not only the child, but the relationships in which that child's growing up. And the best way I can describe that is to use a pair of binoculars. And through one lens in the binoculars, you look at the child's strengths, the child's challenges, the child's genetics and biological inheritance or tendencies or temperament we would think of as biological, like that whole bit about what's contained within the child. But the other lens looks at the relationships in which the child is growing up, and to what extent those relationships are able to nurture the child and scaffold for the child and respond to the child and meet the child's needs and help the child buffer stress, as we talked about, and not create stress for the child. But by putting those two lenses together, you can see, as you can with binoculars, three-dimensionally. So you can see the whole experience of the child. And that's what's important to bring to one of those, difficult moments with the child when you're really cross with them and frustrated with them. Is this, okay, what's happening here? And I think there are a couple of questions you can ask, like, what skills is this child lacking that they're not bringing to the situation or activating at this moment? But just as importantly, what has this child learned to do to adapt to the situation? And I sort of use quotation marks because the child may be adapting to the context of and the dynamics in which they're growing up. It's not adaptive in the sense that it's going to be a useful skill for the rest of their lives, but they may have learned to be really reactive and ramp up quickly because that gets a lot of attention, and finally their problem is solved. But those skills are not ones that we want to reinforce. We want to actually dampen the skills that the children have learned to use to cope with really difficult situations, and provide them with the skills that they really need to manage those problems. So it's a lot to think about when you're in the middle of a crisis with a child, and maybe you can't think about it at that moment. Maybe all you can do is keep yourself calm and provide it a situation where that child is calm. So, are there, an area of your house where there are pillows and the child can go or feels safe, and can you put on some music to calm the child down? Or is there a reading area in the classroom where the child can go and sit and not have to worry about the math today? That's not nearly as important as calming down. And then having a caring adult come and follow up.